January 17, 1943. North Atlantic. 53 degrees N, 29 degrees W. The water was black as oil, heaving in slow, enormous swells beneath a sky that had forgotten the sun. Inside U-504, the air tasted of diesel, sweat, and rust, a thick metallic tang that coated the back of the throat like a film. Oberleutnant Zur C. Fritz Posk stood hunched beneath the low ceiling of the control room, his fingers tracing the penciled coordinates on the navigation chart. Around him, 47 men breathed the same recycled air, their bodies pressed into a steel tube 90 meters long and 6 meters wide, hunting convoys in the killing grounds of the Atlantic. The hydrophone operator sat motionless, his headset clamped over his ears, listening to the deep ocean secrets. A drip of condensation fell from a valve overhead, striking the deck plates with a sound like a clock counting down. At that moment, U-504 was one of nearly 400 operational U-boats prowling the Allied shipping lanes. The steel edge of Admiral Karl Dernitz's underwater Reich, the Rudeltaktik wolf packs that had sent over 14 million tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor since 1939. Posk's crew believed they were invincible. They had been told they were the elite, the technological vanguard, the weapon that would starve Britain into submission. What they did not know, what none of them could have known as they slipped beneath the winter swells, was that their war had already been lost. That within 6 months, the mathematics of survival would invert completely. That by mid-1943, boarding a U-boat would become statistically indistinguishable from a death sentence. The U-boat arm had entered the war as Germany's most promising weapon, the one branch of the Wehrmacht that seemed capable of delivering strategic victory through attrition. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from possessing submarines, but in the shadow years of rearmament, the Kriegsmarine had quietly rebuilt its underwater fleet. When war came in September 1939, Germany possessed only 57 operational U-boats, far fewer than Dönitz believed necessary for a sustained campaign against British commerce. But what they lacked in numbers, they compensated for in doctrine. The wolf pack tactic, Rudeltaktik, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than operating alone, U-boats would mass together, directed by shore-based command, converging on convoys like predators encircling wounded prey. At night on the surface, they would strike from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts, torpedoing merchantmen in chaotic succession, then vanishing into the darkness before dawn. For nearly 3 years, this tactic worked with horrifying efficiency. In 1940 alone, U-boats sank over 4 million tons of Allied shipping. The crews called it the happy time, die glückliche Zeit, when targets were plentiful, defenses were weak, and the odds of survival seemed overwhelmingly in their favor. Young men volunteered for the U-boat service in droves, drawn by the promise of glory, the elite status. The Knights Crosses distributed with unusual frequency to submarine commanders. They believed they were modern knights, sea wolves, hunters in a great and noble cause. But beneath the propaganda, beneath the romantic image of the lone wolf stalking the Atlantic, the reality of U-boat service was already becoming something else entirely, something darker and more desperate. The boats themselves were machines of exquisite claustrophobia. The Type VII, the workhorse of the fleet, measured 67 meters long with an interior pressure hull barely 4 meters wide. Inside, every cubic centimeter was utilized. Torpedoes lined the forward and aft compartments. Batteries filled the bilges. Diesel engines occupied the center. What little space remained was packed with equipment, supplies, and men. There were no showers, no laundry facilities, no privacy. The toilet could only be used when the boat was surfaced. At depth, the pressure made it inoperable, and men urinated into tin cans that were emptied over the side during the night watch. Mold grew on everything, on leather, on bread, on skin. Rats were common. The humidity was so intense that water ran down the bulkheads in constant streams, soaking clothing that never dried. Men slept in shifts, 3 or 4 sharing the same bunk in rotation, a practice called hot bunking. The stench was legendary, a compound of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, bilge water, rotting food, and the chemical toilets that overflowed with disturbing regularity. After 2 weeks at sea, a U-boat could be smelled from a mile away when it surfaced. After 4 weeks, the men themselves became indistinguishable from the machine, their skin pale and greasy, their eyes hollow, their bodies adapted to a lightless world of constant vigilance. Yet they endured it. They endured it because they believed in victory, because they trusted in their commanders, because the propaganda told them they were winning. And for a time, they were. Through 1941 and into 1942, the wolf packs continued their harvest. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 opened an entirely new hunting ground, the American Eastern Seaboard, where merchant ships sailed unescorted and often with lights blazing, silhouetted against the coastal cities like targets on a firing range. Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, sent 5 U-boats to the American coast in January 1942, and in the first month alone they sank 25 ships. Over the following 6 months, U-boats sank over 3 million tons in American waters, often operating in such shallow coastal areas that their commanders could watch the lights of Miami and New York glowing on the horizon. German submariners called it the second happy time, a turkey shoot against an unprepared enemy. The crews returned to their French bases as heroes, greeted with brass bands and ceremonies, their successes broadcast across German radio. Dönitz expanded the U-boat fleet rapidly, launching new boats at an accelerating pace. By the end of 1942, Germany had nearly 400 U-boats operational or under construction. The Battle of the Atlantic seemed to be tilting inexorably toward Germany. One more push, Dönitz believed, one more sustained campaign and Britain's supply lines would snap completely. But something was changing. Something the German crews could feel but could not articulate, a shift in the mathematics of the hunt. The convoys were becoming harder to find. The escorts were more numerous, more aggressive, more coordinated. Aircraft appeared over the mid-Atlantic with disturbing frequency, aircraft that should not have been able to reach so far from land. And when U-boats did find convoys, the attacks that had once been simple and devastating had become complex and dangerous. Ships were equipped with new weapons, ahead-throwing mortars called hedgehogs that fired patterns of contact-fused bombs, depth charges that could be set to detonate at precise depths. Escort vessels could detect submarines at greater ranges and maintain contact through evasive maneuvers. Most disturbing of all, U-boats were being found on the surface at night, found and attacked before they even knew the enemy was near, hit by searchlights and gunfire from aircraft or surface vessels that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Submariners began to whisper about new detection technologies, about invisible rays that could see through darkness and fog. They were not entirely wrong. The Allies had deployed centimetric radar, compact, powerful sets operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths that could detect a surfaced submarine's conning tower from miles away, even in total darkness, even in heavy seas. The Germans had no idea such technology existed. Their radar detectors were calibrated for longer wavelengths and remained completely silent as Allied aircraft closed in for the kill. Then came May 1943 and the mathematics inverted completely. In a single month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, 41, more than 10% of the operational fleet, destroyed in 31 days. The losses were so catastrophic that on May 24, Dönitz made the unprecedented decision to withdraw all U-boats from the North Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, the convoy routes were clear. The withdrawal was supposed to be temporary, a pause to regroup and re-equip. But when the U-boats returned to the Atlantic in the fall, nothing had changed. The killing continued. In fact, it accelerated. July 1943. 37 U-boats lost, August 25, September 29, October 26, November 19. The numbers were relentless, mechanical, grinding the U-boat arm into statistical oblivion. Young commanders who had sailed in triumph 6 months earlier were now being hunted with industrial efficiency. The life expectancy of a U-boat after leaving port had collapsed from multiple patrols to a single voyage. By late 1943, 3 out of every 4 U-boats that put to sea would never return. The men who crewed them knew it. They could see it in the empty berths at Lorient and Brest, in the faces of the crews who did return, gaunt, traumatized, speaking in fragmented sentences about attacks that came from nowhere, about comrades who simply vanished in columns of spray and fire. What the German crews could not fully comprehend was that they were fighting an enemy who had industrialized anti-submarine warfare, with the same ruthless efficiency that Germany had once applied to blitzkrieg. The Allies had cracked the Enigma codes, allowing them to read U-boat communications and route convoys around wolf pack concentrations. They had deployed long-range aircraft, B-24 Liberators equipped with centimetric radar and depth charges, that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats had once operated with relative safety. They had developed new tactics, new weapons, new training regimens. Escort groups were now composed of specialized anti-submarine vessels crewed by men who had spent years perfecting the art of submarine hunting, who could read sonar returns like musicians reading sheet music, who knew exactly how to coordinate aircraft, surface vessels, and depth charges to trap and kill a submarine even when it dove deep and ran silent. The Allies had constructed escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that sailed with the convoys, launching planes that could patrol continuously, forcing U-boats to remain submerged, slow, blind, and helpless. Most crucially, the Allies had achieved numerical superiority. American shipyards were producing merchant vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, launching Liberty ships in assembly line fashion, replacing losses so quickly that the cumulative tonnage of the Allied merchant fleet was actually growing despite the U-boat campaign. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace its submarines fast enough. Each loss represented not just a boat but 45 trained men who had undergone months of specialized training, who possessed skills that could not be quickly replicated. By mid-1943, the U-boat arm was hemorrhaging expertise faster than it could regenerate it. The psychological toll was immense. U-boat crews had entered the war as volunteers, as believers, as young men convinced of their invincibility. Now they sailed knowing they were likely sailing to their deaths. The boats departing from French bases in late 1943 carried crews in their early 20s, boys, really, who had barely finished training before being rushed into operational service. They had never experienced the happy times, had never known what it felt like to hunt without fear. Their entire experience of submarine warfare was one of being hunted, of endless hours submerged while depth charges bracketed them in the darkness, of surfacing at night and scanning the sky in terror, of watching other boats fail to return. The veterans who survived spoke in terse, haunted sentences or did not speak at all. They developed superstitions, rituals, small private prayers to gods they no longer believed in. They wrote letters home that contained nothing but platitudes because the truth was unspeakable. Some requested transfers to surface vessels or to shore duty, willing to face the stigma of cowardice rather than return to the ocean. Most did not bother. They simply climbed back into the steel tubes and went to sea again, because that was what was required of them, because discipline and duty were the last structures holding back the abyss of meaninglessness. The Allies, meanwhile, had transformed the convoy system into a machine of almost geometric precision. Convoys now sailed with multiple escort groups in layered defense, destroyers and frigates on the perimeter, corvettes in close support, escort carriers providing air cover, rescue ships trailing behind to pick up survivors. The merchant vessels themselves sailed in tight formations, zigzagging on coordinated courses that made attacks difficult and detection easy. When a U-boat was detected, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Aircraft would converge from multiple directions, dropping depth charges and sonobuoys while surface vessels closed in from the flanks. The U-boat would be forced to dive, and once submerged, it became slow and nearly blind, dependent on hydrophones that could only provide approximate bearings. The escorts would establish contact with sonar, ASDIC, the British called it, and begin a methodical hunt, pinging continuously, tracking the submarine's movements, coordinating attacks with clinical precision. A single destroyer could maintain contact for hours, waiting for the submarine's batteries to exhaust, for the crew's nerves to break, for a mistake. And mistakes were inevitable. A submarine could only run submerged for so long before it had to surface to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. When it did, the escorts would be waiting. Hedgehog mortars would fire ahead of the ship's track, sending patterns of 24 bombs arcing through the air to splash into the water in a preset pattern, sinking to detonate on contact. A single hit could rupture a pressure hull. More often, multiple hits would strike simultaneously, and the U-boat would simply cease to exist, imploding under the pressure or blown apart by its own torpedoes. The statistics became a language of extinction. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were lost. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, 28,000 died and 5,000 were captured. A 70% fatality rate, higher than any other branch of any military in the war, higher even than the Japanese kamikaze pilots. And most of those deaths occurred after mid-1943, compressed into the final 2 years of the war when the outcome was already decided, when each patrol was an exercise in futility, when the strategic purpose had evaporated and only the killing remained. The U-boat bases in France became morgues with docks, places where young men assembled to die in rotating shifts. The concrete submarine pens, massive bunkers with roofs 5 meters thick, impervious to Allied bombing, protected the boats but could do nothing for the men who took them to sea. They would sail out through the harbors in columns, and weeks later, the boats would fail to return, and new crews would take new boats out to die in their turn, and the cycle would continue until Germany surrendered and the last U-boats were scuttled or surrendered in ports across the Atlantic. In the final year of the war, some U-boats were equipped with the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed them to run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface, avoiding detection by aircraft. It was an innovation born of desperation, and it brought its own horrors. The Schnorchel was fragile, prone to malfunctioning. When it did, when the valve at the top closed due to waves or mechanical failure while the diesels were running, the engines would suck air from inside the boat, creating a rapid pressure drop that burst eardrums and caused excruciating pain. Men would collapse, bleeding from the ears and nose. And even when it functioned correctly, the Schnorchel only allowed the submarine to remain hidden while moving slowly, 4 or 5 knots, making it nearly impossible to reach attack positions or escape from hunters. U-boats became underwater refugees, creeping along at depth for weeks at a time, their crews existing in conditions of medieval squalor, accomplishing nothing, surviving only because they had not yet been found. The few boats that did return to port carried men who looked like concentration camp survivors, emaciated, traumatized, aged decades in weeks. What sustained them in the end was not belief in victory, but simple human resilience, the ability of human beings to endure almost anything when refusal means immediate death. They sustained each other through dark humor, through the bonds formed in extreme conditions, through the animal instinct to survive one more day. They told stories, played cards with waterlogged decks, rationed cigarettes, marked off days on mental calendars. They became connoisseurs of recycled air, able to distinguish between the staleness of air that had been breathed for 6 hours versus 12. They learned to sleep through depth charge attacks, bodies swaying unconsciously with the boat's movements as explosions cracked like thunder in the water around them. They learned to eat cold food from cans, to navigate by touch in darkness, to interpret the submarine sounds, the groan of the hull under pressure, the whir of electric motors, the click and ping of sonar, as fluently as musicians hearing a symphony. And when their boats were hit, when the hull ruptured and the ocean poured in with the force of a collapsing building, they died in darkness and chaos, crushed by pressure or drowned in flooding compartments. Or they survived long enough to reach the surface only to perish from exposure in the frigid Atlantic. Or they were among the tiny fraction who were rescued by Allied vessels and lived to spend the rest of the war in POW camps, haunted by the memory of the steel coffins they had left behind. The U-boat war ended not with a climactic battle, but with a slow, grinding collapse, a statistical certainty that eroded hope until only duty remained. And then duty gave way to surrender. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, Dönitz, who had by then become Hitler's designated successor, ordered all U-boats to surface and proceed to Allied ports for surrender. Some obeyed. Some scuttled their boats rather than hand them over. A few sailed to neutral ports in South America and were interned. But most of the boats were already gone, already resting on the ocean floor with their crews still inside, scattered across the Atlantic in graves that would never be marked, their final positions known only to the fish and the darkness. The men who survived and returned home found a country that did not want to hear about their war, that associated U-boats with unrestricted warfare and atrocity. The French ports where they had been heroes were rubble. The bases were captured. The monuments to their service were either destroyed or repurposed. Their war, unlike the war of the Wehrmacht on land or the Luftwaffe in the air, left almost no physical trace. No battlefields to visit, no ruins to memorialize, just empty ocean and silence. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the strategic value of the U-boat campaign, whether it had ever truly threatened British survival, whether the resources devoted to submarine construction might have been better spent elsewhere. But for the men who served, for the 28,000 who died in steel tubes beneath the waves, strategy was irrelevant. They had been sent to sea with insufficient preparation, inadequate technology, and after mid-1943, virtually no chance of survival. They had been asked to fight a war that was already lost,